When I moved to the Micro Four Thirds system, I started off with just the Panasonic G9, but I always wanted a second camera. Firstly, because I like having a spare when I'm in the field, just in case. Secondly, because I often shoot with two cameras, particularly if I'm shooting things like wildlife, or if I'm in an area that I don't want to be changing lenses. And thirdly, because I obviously shoot a lot of video, talk to camera like this, where I want to be able to explain what I'm doing, showing the camera that I'm using. So I went out and did a bit of investigation on what camera would be most suitable, and I came up with this. This is the Panasonic GX8. At the time, about a year ago, this was not available in production. It had been superseded, and I thought, well, why don't I just look at some of the more modern ones. This camera's now about 4 or 5 years old, but I really like this one because it's light, it's compact. It was available second-hand, albeit rarely. It obviously was a popular camera at the time. And the other thing that I liked about this camera is that it has the same sensor in it that my G9 does. So I get comparable image quality and video quality using the same lenses on the same sensor. And when I found this one second-hand, it came with the Panasonic Lumix 25mm f1.7 lens. And that immediately made me think of this. This is my good old faithful Pentax K1000, the first SLR camera I ever bought, more than 40 years ago now. This still works. It's fully mechanical. It's built like a brick. Everything's manual. It does have a tiny little battery that sits in here, one of those old, what we used to call watch batteries. And that's only required to run the light meter. If you can evaluate light without using a meter, then you don't need a battery, and it just works. Although I must confess I haven't run a roll of film through this for about 20 years. But I used to shoot this a lot when I first got it, just walking around the streets and finding interesting things to point the camera at and shoot. But it's fully manual. It's got a 50mm f1.7 lens, the exact equivalent of this lens on the Micro Four Thirds system. It's manual focus, it's manual aperture setting, it's manual shutter speed setting, it's manual ISO or ASA at the time setting, and I thought, why not see if I can replicate the way that I used to shoot that using this newer camera of just doing a walk through the streets of Melbourne, shooting it in complete manual mode. No tripod, no IBIS, manual focus, manual exposure setting, no cheating and using the LCD screen, no reviewing images, taking another one and so on. A virtual 36 shot roll of film. So I have 36 shots, take it or leave it. Back to the way I used to shoot 40 years ago. So to make the experience even more authentic for you, I'm going to shoot everything on my iPhone. All the video, the audio directly through the condenser microphone on the iPhone, which is pretty good. I hope that gives you a bit of the sort of environmental sound and the experience of walking around the city with me. I hope it's not too annoying. I'm only going to get one crack at this, so whatever it is, it'll be. I will add a gimbal so that I can get a bit more stabilised walking around shots, but also enable me to do some talk to camera vlogging style shots without it being too close up. So let's have a look and see how I go. I'm here at Queen Victoria Market. It's a Melbourne tradition on a Saturday morning to come down here to this old market and buy your fresh fruit and veggies and fish and meat. I used to do the same thing when I was a student at university, living close by, jump on my bicycle at 6 o'clock in the morning and come down and try and get some fruit and veggie bargains. Let's go and have a look and see what we can find. It's a great place for people watching too. always on the lookout for interesting shop windows.
Melbourne has an interesting mix of old and new architecture, so it's always worth spending some time having a look for angles and lines and patterns. So I'm going to take a few shots as we're going today of some of the architecture, and mostly because of the focal length that I'm using, I'll be framing up particular aspects of it rather than whole buildings. Melbourne Central Shopping Centre was built about the time I started to go to university, and it was built around this giant shop tower which was heritage listed, so they couldn't tear it down, and they wanted to put a shopping centre on top of one of the underground railway stations that was being built. So this is what we have, a shop tower built into the middle of a shopping centre. I'm here in front of the State Library of Victoria on Swanston Street in Melbourne, and I'm going to go in and take a photograph of the dome roof on the La Trobe Reading Room. It's one of Melbourne's great pieces of architecture. Unfortunately, with a 25mm lens on micro 4/3, it's going to be nowhere near wide enough to show you the grandeur of the place, but you can't do a street walk of Melbourne without taking this photograph. Like many major cities around the Western world, Melbourne has a Chinatown, and it's spectacular during Chinese New Year with dragon parades and specials on in all the restaurants. And it's quite good to shoot at night, but because I'm hand holding, no long shutter speeds, I'm going to walk up through here in the middle of the day and see if I can find a couple of shots. Melbourne's iconic Flinders Street station, the front on view of which has been completely destroyed by that skyscraper in the background. This is probably Melbourne's most famous landmark for Melburnians, and those historic clock faces at the front above the steps used to be the standard meeting place for people in Melbourne. How to shoot this in a way that is different, I'm not sure, but I'm going to give it a go. See if I can get a couple of photographs that are not just this straight on front view.
Melbourne is famous for its arcades and laneways, many of which have been turned into alfresco eating locations.
Hosier Lane is probably Melbourne's most famous graffiti lane. There are many, but this one's got the name, and it also happens to be right next door to a great tapas restaurant. It's almost impossible to walk up and down here during daylight hours without having other people here.
Federation Square is what suffices for a city square in Melbourne, and it's full of some really interesting, if not controversial, architecture. But it's quite difficult to get an interesting shot, particularly with a full-frame 50mm equivalent lens. So I'm going to try and get some close-up shots just looking at lines and patterns.
Well, I'm here at the Art Centre and National Gallery, again one of Melbourne's iconic locations, and it's been shot 1,000 times, so I'm going to try and find a few different angles but still get the essence of the buildings and what's going on here. There's always something going on. As you can probably hear in the background, there's a gypsy violin busker just down the road who's amplified and really loud. But it just makes for more fun on the street in Melbourne. Well, there's no more iconic shot than this. Prince's Bridge over the Yarra River, running straight up Swanston Street with St Paul's Cathedral, Flinders Street Station, and part of the city skyline of Melbourne behind it. With a 50mm lens, this is not going to be a panorama shot of the bridge that you typically get from this point of view, but I'm going to see what I can get.
One of Melbourne's more interesting bars built into the pylon on this footbridge.
There's another footbridge here. It used to be a railway bridge that crossed over the Yarra to go down to South Melbourne and St Kilda. But now it's another footbridge that goes over to Flinders Street Station from Southgate. And along this bridge, there's representation of all the people who were originally from this part of the country and who migrated here. Every country is represented. Melbourne is multicultural.
It wouldn't be a day out in Melbourne without photographing a tram, and I finally found one of these old W-class trams that I used to catch when I was a child.
Well, I got one shot left. It's been a long day. One shot on a virtual 36 shot roll of film. I've got about a 2.5 kilometre walk back to the car, and I'm sure I can find one thing to shoot. It's always a challenge, and it used to be when shooting film and you're on your last shot. You get a little bit more selective. Anyway, we'll see what we can find.
Well, if you've liked this video, please like, subscribe, click the little bell to get notified when I make new videos, tell your friends, and please feel free to comment below. But remember, pixels are free, so get out there and shoot more. Bye for now.